with a compelling perspective on global politics. This is the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT Radio.
All right, so we're in the second hour of this live broadcast. Thank you guys for joining us. We're going to be joined imminently by TNT's political editor, Basil Valentine, who's going to come in on the line in just a few minutes. And a big thank you, of course, to Arnaud Devolay, author of Foreign Entanglements. The new book is out. I dropped a link to Amazon in the chat room there, you guys. So you definitely want to get your orders in. You can get it on Kindle. I think the consignment that they had of the physical book, Amazon's already sold out. But I think the publisher's going to be delivering new copies this week. So they'll get those moving. So yeah, get your orders in because yeah, it looks like a lot of people are interested in this book. And as we were saying with Arnaud, I think it's because of the timing of the book and this whole Burisma terrorism slush fund story that sort of emerged in the last week. Very serendipitous with the release of Arnaud's book. So, I mean, I managed to read this early. He asked me to write a review, so the publishers gave me privy to early access. I wrote a review. Part of that's on the back of the cover of this book. You'll see short review from myself and also Cynthia McKinney, former U.S. Congresswoman, and Dan Kovalik, who is actually Dan Kovalik wrote the first Russia book, the sort of Russiagate book. He's a human rights lawyer, a former law lecturer at Pittsburgh University. And yeah, Dan's also written a short review on this as well. So I mean, there's some pretty good people have endorsed this book, and I think more people are going to endorse it in the coming weeks and months because the receipts are in here. It's just one of those things. It's like when you're holding this book, you know, you've got basically all the receipts to Biden corruption and all the corruption from sort of the Democratic donor class in Ukraine, plus just generally the U.S. establishment's external management. So they all talk about Ukrainian sovereignty. You hear this. You just heard it in one of the hearings. I think it was a Senate hearing or whatever. And they're talking about, we need to give the Ukrainians, they asked point blank, can Ukraine win? They said, we believe in the sovereignty of Ukraine. They keep saying this in Washington. We believe in the sovereignty. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Listen, newsflash, Ukraine has not been a sovereign country for a very long time, at least since 2014. It's the most unsovereign country probably in the world at this particular moment in time. Completely funded, completely subsidized, micromanaged externally by Washington, by London, and by NATO. So there's no sovereignty. They don't have elections. They've outlawed the oldest Orthodox church in the country. There's no press. There's no free press. There's no opposition parties. There's nothing democratic nor sovereign about Ukraine as it stands. Now they're conscripting basically any male with a pulse between the age of, I don't know, like 20 and 60. There's grandfathers being dragged out and thrown in trenches with like used uniforms. In fact, I saw stories of uniforms being issued with bullet holes in them. Okay, so I don't need to say any more. It's a complete fiasco in Ukraine. So not much sovereignty going on there, and it just plays such a central role in the foreign policy and the story of Washington, of Donald Trump as well, the persecution of Trump and all of his associates. A lot of this tracks back to Ukraine and covering up the corruption in Ukraine. That's what first impeachment hearings against Trump was. It was to basically bury all of the Biden corruption and pave the way for Joe's run for president. That's why that impeachment process was started to begin with. There was no crime by Donald Trump. Anyway, let's bring on to the program right now, political editor for TNT Radio, Basil Valentine, is joining us on the line right now. Basil, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Patrick. Good to be with you, and hello to our viewers and listeners all around the world.
So what do you make right now of the international scene, Basil? I know you've been busy following all the top headlines, both domestically and internationally. What do we need to know right now?
Well, we're all sitting here really with bated breath, waiting to find out what Iran is going to do in retaliation for the attack on their embassy in Syria. And, the Russian consulate has now put out a warning saying to its citizens not to travel to the Middle East. The German airline Lufthansa has suspended flights to various destinations in the region. The United States has restricted its employees' travel in Israel, outside the greater Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Beersheba area in case of attack. Matthew Miller said today, "We conduct ongoing assessments all the time about the situation on the ground. I'm not going to speak to the specific assessments that led us to restrict our employees and family members' personal travel. But clearly, we are monitoring the threat environment in the Middle East and specifically in Israel." This after the Iranian foreign minister has been shuttling around from Turkey to the Arab Emirates, Qatar, talking to his counterparts, and I suppose assessing what the international support would be for various options that may be on the table. Our own Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, has spoken to him, Amir Abdullahian, and said that a response to Israel's attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Abdullahian said, would be legitimate. Cameron, on the other hand, has asked Iran to de-escalate, and Iran must not draw the Middle East into a wider conflict. Well, David, shouldn't you be telling that to the Israelis?
Yeah, I know there's total gaslighting going on in this. If you listen to the news releases on this, when you hear Iranian attacks, Israel's bracing for Iranian attacks, America's concerned about Iranian attacks. They're not Iranian attacks. When you hear anybody say this in any news broadcast, that is gaslighting. They're reading off a script. It would be Iranian retaliation for an Israeli unprovoked attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus by Israel. So Iran reserves the right, and under international law, can retaliate, because is that not an act of war, Basil, to attack and blow up somebody's embassy? What do you think?
Yeah, the embassy is theoretically the country of Iran. That's the way diplomacy works with international missions, is that if it's a freehold building, then the soil on which the freehold is held by a foreign country is that country. So there's a postage stamp size part of 150 different countries in London, for example, although the American footprint down in Vauxhall is much bigger than a postage stamp. But yeah, that's supposed to be the case. There does seem to be one way out, which is if the United Nations Security Council condemn the attack. Amir Abdullahian said that if the UN fails to condemn the attack, then a legitimate defense with the aim of punishing the aggressor is a necessity and is legitimate. So if the Security Council do condemn the attack, then perhaps the necessity of retaliation would be reduced. But, the Iranians have got their own domestic population to think about, who will be demanding some kind of retaliation. And what's more, of course, if the Israelis can do this once and get away with it effectively because of collective international pressure on the Iranians to de-escalate, then they will do so again.
I agree with you on the UN Security Council point, Basil. Theoretically, that would reduce the tension. I think that would be a positive thing. Isn't that what the UN Security Council exists for, is for things like this? Shouldn't they pass a resolution? Shouldn't everybody agree? Because don't all of these countries have sovereign territory and embassies and diplomatic facilities around the world? And if they're green-lighting Israel to attack and blow up people's embassies unprovoked, aren't they opening the door for future chaos at their door in some time in the future, Basil?
Well, I think the entire United Nations Security Council would almost certainly condemn it, with the exception, of course, of Britain and the United States. Now, I could see us abstaining, possibly, but it might boil down to, will the United States use its veto? According to the State Department, Tony Blinken has spoken to the Turkish, Chinese and Saudi Arabian foreign ministers in the last 24 hours to make clear that escalation in the Middle East is not in anyone's interest.
I always thought when I saw this attack, I don't know if you agree or not, Basil, but when I saw Israel hit the Iranian embassy in Damascus, I thought, why are they doing this other than to try to provoke Iran to retaliate, to hit back, which would then automatically draw the United States into a potential direct confrontation with Iran. And this is exactly what the Biden administration are saying now. They're doing all they can to prepare and what they would do to retaliate against an Iranian strike, an Iranian attack. You see how this has all been conveniently kind of arranged at the moment to create a narrative, Basil, and that's that somehow Iran is hell-bent on attacking Israel and the U.S. And now you've got Marco Rubio and all the rest of them getting their World War III boots on.
The White House has told Iran that it was not involved directly. We communicated to Iran that the US had no involvement in the strike that happened in Damascus, and we have warned Iran not to use this attack as a pretext to escalate further in the region or to attack US facilities or personnel, according to Karine Jean-Pierre. But why do they not make any reference to who did carry out the attack? It's as if Israel doesn't exist in these statements from the White House and from the State Department spokespeople, doesn't it?
So here's what Joe Biden says, Basil. He says, Biden vows ironclad U.S. commitment to Israel amid fears of Iran attack. Again, no mention in this beginning of this article that it is Israel itself that has attacked and blown up an Iranian embassy. It just doesn't even exist in sort of headlines on this. So I see a kind of an operation here in the media, and it's almost like this is eerily familiar to the kind of WMD deception that we saw in the run-up to the Iraq War, where the press seemed to be totally on board with war escalation, and we're just misreporting and trying to willfully deceive the public on all this. So the U.S. president and allied officials fear significant strike within days in retaliation for the Israeli bombing a consulate building in Damascus. I mean, also, Basil, my false flag alarm is going off full blare right now. I mean, it's like if a bomb went off of some description somewhere in the world, who are they going to blame? Immediately, the blame will go to fill in the blank. What do you think?
That's always a danger, although the Iranians haven't been framed in that way as much as, let's say, sort of other nefarious groups, there's always the chance of it. But talking about war escalation, as we speak, there is a Demand Victory Rafah Now rally taking place in Jerusalem. Several hundred people demanding a ground offensive in the southern Gaza Strip right now, which they say will result in a complete victory. That's the sort of the pro-war movement flexing its muscles in Israel. Meanwhile, it's worth remembering that something like 70 people have been killed in the last 36 hours in Rafah as a result of airstrikes. It's almost as if this passes off now completely without incident. That's why I feel constrained to mention it. Imagine for just a moment that 70 Israelis had been killed over the last 72 hours in Israel as a result of strikes by Hamas. The wailing would be audible all the way from Tel Aviv to Washington, but because it's Palestinians dying, barely a ripple, Patrick, if that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm a little bit concerned. I know you are as well. A lot of people have seen very disturbing signs here, very worrying signs that something is afoot, that something is being planned, some sort of escalation. And I think unfortunately the wheels are already in motion on this. I'm hoping that there's just somebody sane in Washington, especially, that will step forward and maybe hit the brakes, because this has happened before. The United States has been on a path of escalation, particularly with Iran. This happened under the Trump administration. We found out later, after the fact, Basil, that we came very close to kind of launching a war against Iran. and it was the Donald Trump administration that hit the brakes. The war hawks, Lindsey Graham and everybody else, was basically on board with some sort of strike against Iran at the time during the Trump administration, and that stopped. That's not to say Donald Trump unfortunately followed up with what I thought was a terrible move in assassinating Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Melendez in January of 2020. But that's unfortunate footnote of history there. So where does that leave us right now with, I think UNICEF aid workers have been killed in Gaza. So interesting series of events following the murder of the aid workers from the World Central Kitchen just last week, in fact, that spurred a huge wave of international indignation and outrage. Basil, have you heard anything about this latest UNICEF incident?
Yeah, UNICEF car was hit by gunfire. I don't know if anybody was killed, to be honest. But just to go back, it's making me laugh, but Iranian threats to carry out a missile strike against Israel are unacceptable. The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said that dreadful word that, where does someone like Sunak get off? Why has he not immediately come out and condemned the strike on the embassy to begin with? It's so one-sided. It turns out that the awful Annalena Baerbock, the woman masquerading as the German foreign minister, has called her Iranian counterpart Amir Abdullahian to urge maximum restraint. So we really are.
Iran hasn't threatened. They haven't threatened a missile salvo against anybody, to my knowledge. Is this like they've just conjured up that a threat has somehow automatically been made when it hasn't actually been made by any Iranian officials? They haven't said we're going to hit you with a missile salvo tomorrow. I've not seen that report. So what are these Western political leaders talking about?
Well, the danger is that that Iran may use its proxies in southern Lebanon, in Hezbollah, to attack a major target on Israeli soil. And the Americans have said that if that happens, then they may intervene on Israel's behalf. So, that's the danger. It would be much
against
safer
Iran, intervene against Iran. So yes. This is that adds another confusing dimension to all this, Basil, is that if anything is then blamed on Hezbollah, and again, I talked earlier about a false flag potential. Some incident could be blamed on Hezbollah. You know how the U.S. and Western media are going to react. They're going to say Iran, 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 and then we're off to the races at that point. That's a dangerous, I think, point here. The tension needs to be dialed down. Somebody needs to step forward and dial this tension down like immediately. But I don't see anybody who's capable or willing to do that at the moment.
Well, other than just this endless mantra of urging the Iranians to act with restraint, why doesn't somebody tell the Israelis to act with restraint? I mean, simultaneously bombing Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza. Iran's permanent mission to the UN has, of course, criticized the Security Council for failing to condemn Israel's reprehensible act of aggression. They posted a statement on the X platform saying the imperative for Iran to punish this rogue regime, Israel, might have been obviated had the council condemned it. So with one day of the working week to go, tomorrow, Friday, it's to be hoped that there is at least a motion put before the Security Council, because, otherwise all bets are off, as they say.
No, it's very, very dangerous, very problematic situation that we find ourselves in here. And this is the danger of escalation and no diplomacy, no negotiations, and really running gunboat diplomacy and leaving it up to the hawks. You get these sort of situations. This is like that inevitability, Basil, of the reports. When you read the historical accounts of the run-up to the First World War, they all say, well, there was an air of inevitability, that this Great War was going to happen and had to happen in Europe. And it surely did. And the devastation that was wrought as a result, well, we all know our history with World War I. I can't see that there would be a happy ending to World War III, other than a lot of misery and destruction as a result. Totally avoidable, though, as was World War I. But some actors behind the scenes have other ideas on these things. And unfortunately, they're not as reasonable or rational, maybe, as we are in the way that we're presenting our arguments here. But I do see those parallels, Basil. Your final thoughts before we go to break.
Yeah, I'm not a student of the First World War. I studied medieval history, so what we've got at the moment is certainly the most dangerous situation of the last 25 years. We can say that, I think, without fear of contradiction. I mean, we've got the potential for World War III breaking out in two separate places simultaneously, with the hawks in NATO talking about boots in the ground. Zelensky's had to pass a new law today lowering the age of conscription and changing the terms on which people are conscripted. It's now down from 27 to 25. The Ukrainian defense officials are saying they're outnumbered by 7 or 10 to 1 in key areas by the Russians, and are demanding more cannon fodder, basically, which was, of course, the case in World War I. In some ways, the war in Ukraine and isn't all that different from the First World War, in as much as it consists of serried ranks of artillery bombing and shelling each other, which is precisely what they did in World War I, with the eerie no man's land in between. It's really not that dissimilar, Patrick.
So then that leads us to the final question, Basil. Is World War III on the ballot in the 2024 U.S. election? It's Biden or Trump. Is World War III on the ballot?
Well, the general thinking is that Trump is less likely to go for World War III. David Cameron was sent away with a flea in his ear by Trump and his campaign staff earlier this week. The official statement from Trump's spokesperson after their meeting at Mar-a-Lago was that, amongst other things they talked about, was ending the killing in Ukraine. Well, Trump has said he could end the war within 24 hours. Ending the killing is very different from David Cameron's agenda, which is to continue the killing, just to make sure that Ukraine have got sufficient bullets to do their share of the killing. That's David Cameron's stated position. So it was noteworthy, I think, that the language, which is always very carefully selected on these occasions from Trump's spokesperson, talked about ending the killing. And, in his own way, although obviously a fervent supporter of the Israelis, I think Trump would be, put it this way, more active in seeking to find a solution to the situation in Gaza, because even people like Tim Kaine, Hillary's running mate, and a staunch sort of parrot of the endless mantra about Israel's right to defend himself, he's come out and said that he thinks Netanyahu has played Joe Biden over the last 6 months. And, that's the general consensus, really, that he's taken Biden for a ride. And the president has been far too passive, far too inactive, really, for months now, and allowed the absolutely horrific situation over there to develop.
Basil Valentine, political editor at TNT. Really appreciate you joining us this week. Take care.
Thank you, Patrick.
I'm going to take a short break right now with the network, and when we come back, we're going to welcome onto the stage a very special guest, former political consultant, maybe still a political consultant, but best-selling author. Roger Stone is going to be joining us on the program in just a minute, so you don't want to miss that. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back.